our first keynote speaker today is Stuart McCracken. So Stuart is the Vice President of Exploration and Geoscience at Teck. And Stuart has over 20 years of global exploration experience, including 5 years of corporate mine industry experience in London. He's a pretty fluent Spanish speaker. He's led the role he's taken a lead role in 2 major feasibility studies and been a team member for 3 base metals exploration discoveries. So had great success through his career to date. His specialties include exploration from grassroots through to in-mine, project management, exploration risk, base metals, geoscience R&D, carbonate sedimentology, and this is a word that I had to learn, diogenesis, and geometallurgy. And Stuart will be talking to us today about the evolving role of geoscientists in a digital ore body knowledge world. So join me in welcoming Stuart. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity today. This talk came out of a meeting. Excellent. A meeting we had, Dave and I, in London back in September, I think, and Dave suggested I talk today, and he gave me the very vague instructions that he'd like me to talk about the future, which was not very helpful, but it does give me amazing latitude on what to talk about. So for me, I've been around for a long time in this industry, working for companies like Western Metals, now defunct zinc explorer in Australia, Anglo American, some interactions with De Beers, and now with Teck. And through that time, I've been involved in a lot of these kinds of evaluations of what the future could be, putting together roadmaps, thinking about where innovation's going, what's coming in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years' time. And I think I can pretty honestly say in almost every case, we've been wrong. So the things we thought were going to come either haven't come or haven't come yet, and we missed the things that were really big that did come. So I think one of the interesting things about trying to predict the future is be very humble, because you probably will get it wrong. And it goes down to this sort of idea of a portfolio. You need to have a range of bets to think what could be coming. So I'm going to try to do that today, but not right now. I'm actually going to digress quite badly just for now and come back to that subject at the end. What I'm about to do, please, there's a contents warning. I will not give any great graphs, data. All my team's in the audience, they can deluge you with data. I'm going to give you more sort of a conversation around what I think is happening to us as geoscientists as we evolve through this change we're going through. We're clearly having this amazing deluge of data coming at us. We're thinking about new ways to look at it, whether it's machine learning, AI, things are changing. So what are we as geoscientists going to be in the future as this thing happens? But firstly, the digression. So I was thinking about this subject over Christmas and the holiday break, and then something really fun happened. I'm sure you've seen this. So this young lad in Oklahoma, Willis, or Blue Scooty, he beat Tetris. Now, this was really fun for me because I must admit I spent a lot of time procrastinating for my PhD by playing Tetris back in the 90s. So, and I think I managed to get to about level 5. So I thought it was pretty good at that time, but this little kid comes along and just destroys it. And on face value, and what the press really pushed out was this young lad sitting in his mum's basement, presumably, manages to beat this computer program. But the more I looked into it, it was this remarkable community that really led to this success. So he was accessing this incredible group around the world. They were sharing innovations, whether it was how they held the game controller. They'd run some basic AI machine learning on where the fault would come into the system. They knew what would happen and they'd predicted it. They just had to get to that point by almost overcoming the human issue. So AI had pointed the way. They then had to actually be flexible, focused for 40 minutes to actually get to that kill screen. Remarkable. And what was fascinating was over this time of getting to this point, I think Tetris first came out in the 80s, Russian program. Within about a week of Willis breaking it, someone else had broken it. So it's this interesting thing about human performance. Often we'll have these barriers that we think are there. When someone breaks it, then suddenly anyone can break it after that. So amazing example. So why am I using this example? For me, it's an interesting linkage of data, big data, of digital problems, but more importantly, collaboration. This was not solved by an individual. This is solved by a team around the world who, despite the fact they were competing in competitions, were actually really happy to share their successes. And so sharing their cheat bits, the way they held the controller, how they could get to different levels, it was a very open sharing of information. And there's been a few comments today of, wouldn't it be wonderful if we openly shared all of our information? So, example from a 13-year-old in Oklahoma. So I'll come back to this, but I think it's an interesting point for us to just think about how we behave as humans in this increasingly digital world. So just becoming a bit more corporate for a second. At Tech, we're involved across a very broad part of the value chain in geoscience. So the team that I lead, Exploration Plus Geoscience, we're looking after the greenfields exploration in frontiers around the world. We're doing the brownfields around the mine sites. We then have a team that's very much embedded in the mines, thinking about how we can improve the way we mine, get the greatest value out of the mines, and then ultimately, how do the mines shut? So this whole cradle to grave concept of how do you actually effectively go from an exploration through to a closure, and how do we ensure that everything we're doing is what the clients want, the people who buy our product, but also the communities around us. So there's interesting feedback. So through this linear journey, as it's shown on that slide, there are a whole series of feedback loops and double loop learning that we go through on taking the ore body knowledge and helping our exploration models, taking our exploration models and thinking how we'll build a mine, taking our ore body knowledge and how that informs the kind of concentrates or the products we'll produce, how we are going to interact with our communities, and constantly learning how to do it better. So it's a series of loops in this as we move through this value chain of how we interchange and interact that information across the different functions in our company. Shown a different way, the workflow. So we've all talked today about different ways of collecting data, and we now have these incredible tools at our fingertips that are collecting this deluge, this mountain of information. And I think the challenge for us is how do we actually handle that? So whether it's at the drill rig, in the core yard, in the mine, how do you take all this information that we're getting and actually make some kind of sense out of it? How do you use it in a most efficient way and in a timely way? So and the mine sense example just now, where you can have that information almost the second that it's mined, is astonishing, that you actually can have that information to allow decisions. That's our challenge here, of how do we actually get this information in a way that allows us to make decisions quickly, effectively, in an agile way. For me, it's been interesting, 30 years of a career and going from the very early stage of just being a human, logging core, with no instruments at all other than a compass, maybe a scratcher, a hand lens. Evolving through seeing the first sort of XRFs come in, seeing PEMAs as they first became relevant, seeing these other technologies, various laser systems for mapping structure in mines. I think what I've noticed through this time is humans are being separated from the rocks. Now, that's not a bad thing necessarily. There are good safety reasons for it. There's good reasons to allow us to use our time doing other things. But as I would explore on this subject, it is meaning we are detached a little bit from the subject matter that we're doing, and sometimes we are trusting the machine a little bit too much. The other area that we're completely deluged in information is our historical databases for exploration. So Tech, as a company, through its various iterations of over 100 years of knowledge and exploration around the world, we had boxes and boxes of data, CDs, zip drives, jazz drives, USBs, you name it, sitting in various warehouses around the place. That information was completely unusable, unattainable, because we didn't really know what we had and we couldn't access it easily. And like many companies, we are going through this sort of Pac-Man way of eating that mountain of data a little bit every year as you needed it. So we took decision about 2.5 years ago to bite the bullet and digitize the whole thing. And it was very much to the idea of digitalising the process so that we could then have all this information accessible to put whatever machine we wanted to at that data. So we've got to the point now, and it's 10 terabytes and growing. It's incredible amount of data. We know there's duplication, triplication, all that in that data. We're using machine learning with some good partners to understand just how to arrange that information. The next question is, how do we actually find the jewels in that data? I know through our own experience in tech, Tina was found in data, our discovery in Australia, a zinc ore body a number of years ago. That was in a database somewhere. Kamoa was in another database with another company before Friedland found it in the DRC. So these things do exist in databases. They may not have been recognised yet. So these kind of repositories of information could be where we find the next generation of mines if we think about them and can ask the right questions of the data. So the next couple of slides is really just me riffing on the idea of who are we as geoscientists and what is our role going to be as we go forward. So the image here is one of our mines in eastern Canada, or eastern BC. Now, if you look at the bottom part of the slide, you'll see this incredibly ordered waste dump. Beautiful pattern, almost fish scale. That's because this is an autonomous part of the mine. So the machine learning, or AI, is running the trucks. Therefore, the material is being dumped in this wonderfully ordered way because that's what they're told to do. And so you're getting this wonderful pattern of material being dumped in that part of the mine there. So this was the autonomous part of the mine. I had the joy of driving around with one of the geos. The vehicle was set up with a very large screen. She had to follow a very defined path. The trucks were also doing the same thing. The trucks were given zones. The machine would tell them where they could drive, when they could drive. And so you ended up with this remarkable, and you can see it beautifully on this, very almost polished routes through the mine where the vehicles were following exactly the same path perfectly, working really well. As we followed one of the large dump trucks that was loading waste, a very large lump of sandstone fell off the back of the truck. The lady who was driving the vehicle, she hit a button to indicate that there was something on the road. A vehicle popped out of a corner of the mine and a human jumped out and cleaned up after the truck. And to me, it was just an anecdote on what are we going to be? Are we, in these autonomous mines, going to be the cleaning agents for the machines? Or are we actually going to be driving the machines in some intellectual way? So yeah, it's a facile example, but it was just a sort of, wow, where are we and what are we doing as humans in this interaction that we're creating as we design these modern mines? The next example is from Quebrada Blanca, our new mine in Chile, northern Chile, and using IMDEX's wonderful blast dog. So I'll set the video running. So in this case, once again, an autonomous part of the mine, the hassle of getting that machine into this mine has been immense. Aisha's not here today, but she probably lost a few years of her life trying to negotiate the contracts to get into this place. And effectively, the geologist has to sit in this pickup truck and babysit this device. So this device is producing amazing amount of data. It's logging the blast holes, creating all this wonderful information we can use for blasting, for where the water is, type of ore, the quality of the ore. It's an amazing data set. The challenge we have is how do we get it into the mine and run it effectively when all this other stuff is happening around it? And secondly, how do we actually use the information? It's creating so much information that is actually swamping the software solutions we currently have. So once again, it's both what is the role of the geologist in managing this process as the machine creates all this data, and then how do we actually take all this amazing data it's created and create some reason from it? And I think that's an example of the software providers having to almost catch up with where the data's got to and start creating those solutions that allow us to actually use this amazing new source of data. And the last example is more back to exploration. So yeah, man versus machine. So Chris is sitting on a hill there in western Kazakhstan. He does like a very large hand lens, you'll notice. And he's surrounded by a sea of cover. in that area. Versus, I think that's Curiosity. So Curiosity on Mars, and this amazing set of tools, little drill sets, the whole thing it had to basically travel around Mars and collect some amazing data. Now, obviously, Chris can walk much faster than Curiosity could travel, so that's one advantage. I'd also challenge that we do bring something to our process that a geologist has that maybe the Curiosity rover didn't have, the ability to make decisions on the fly, to think more carefully about why we do certain things. What I find fascinating is just last week at the big conference in Saudi Arabia, ERG released this monster. So this is their Nomad. So Nomad is effectively a Mars rover, but brought to Earth. The idea of that is you send it out and it can go and collect, they claim 120 soil samples a day. Their figure is a human can only do 30. Now, I think that's a rather pessimistic view of a human, but in their model, this machine is much faster, much safer. It can drill down to, I think, 800 mils. It can do the basic analysis of the samples. It collates the samples. It's basically doing the job of a very efficient field assistant, albeit in a very easy place to work. I would challenge that machine going to the Golden Triangle, for example, and trying to actually do sampling. But it does show where potentially we're going with some of this technology that allows us to take these incredible innovations that NASA has had in off-world situations and almost bring them back on-world, and how do we use them to improve what we do here? Maybe the future is different. So I'm not an expert on AI, so I've just used a bit of a sort of back and forwards here to compare AI or machine learning, however you want to call it, on the left versus the human on the right. And there's no denying that these new tools are going to give us the ability to assess massive volumes of data, to troll through things that are too big for us as humans. They'll recognize patterns. They'll be very good at finding those issues that are consistent or interesting within the data. But I'll just point out the final three on both sides. I think as people talk about, AI doesn't have an ethical framework to work by. It doesn't have common sense. Now, I'm hoping that most humans do, but there is a proviso on that, depends on the human. Once again, creativity and emotion. I think as geoscientists, we do have this almost artistic bent to us at times. We all love colored pencils, right? So it's how do you get that kind of characteristic into a machine to make those same kinds of illogical jumps in the data that we often do when especially in exploration, we almost have to interpret beyond the data. And then of course, we're hearing about hallucinations in the big LNMs. So is the machine almost coming up with its own solutions that aren't grounded in reality or aren't real? Once again, depends on the human, how better we are at that. But I think it's interesting that where we're at with this interaction, and as I say, are we going to be the supervisor and partner of AI or something different? Certainly from my vision right now, and I understand the world is changing very rapidly, but for me, our role as geoscientists is to create a system through AI that gives us this incredible data, that orders it in the right sort of way that can be properly assessed, but then ask the right questions. I think so far we are still probably better at asking the questions than the machine is. I think the machine, we can see through ChatGPT, can ask questions, but are they asking the really out there crazy ideas that we need to ask to make a difference to what we're trying to do? It's a question. I don't know yet. I think that this is where the hallucination comes in. It's the way the machine works may actually come out with some really left field ideas, just as we like to have mavericks in our exploration teams who will also come up with left field ideas. Are we going to almost have a machine and a human competing to be the maverick in the data? So for me, we're at this interesting time. We're collecting massive amount of data. We're being swamped by it. We are getting the systems to collate it, to bring it together, to understand it. It's where do we go next as a tribe, as a group of individuals who call ourselves geoscientists? What is our role in this space about how we evaluate this information? And that photo there is the Antamina mine up in Peru. For those who've worked in mines, we know that we're being almost kept out of that space now. If you've worked as a mine geo 30 years ago, your role was to always go up to the face, map the face, take samples, be very much in the mine. Most modern mines don't let a geologist anywhere near the face. You cannot go really and sample that environment anymore. So we are more reliant on these tools to both collect the data, analyze the data, and give us some kind of answer. So interesting crossroads. All right, so back to actually what Dave asked me to talk about. This is based on a very informal survey of a peer group. I'm not going to name names, it's just a group of very intelligent SME geoscientists and their view on what the future looks like. A few of them will make sense. And the mining metaverse, some kind of almost digital twin of the Earth, or data cubes, as people would call them. How do we actually create a digital sandbox to work in that allows us to think about how to do things within a mining context or an exploration context inside the data, but in a way that we can play out scenarios. So have that metaverse to play in. Not dissimilar, but when we do 3D modeling, we often are constrained. As a mine geo, I was doing structural modeling. I was constrained by my ideas on what the structure should look like. The advantage of something like an AI is that it won't be as potentially restricted in its thought process as I was as a geologist thinking certain directions. So it has a broader scope at which to explore the ideas. Similar thing, you'll see there's a theme here, AI, AI, AI. As the blast dog's showing, and where the CET was doing in Australia, this idea of trying to get much more data as we drill. We drill a lot of holes in this industry, and we're not collecting all the information that we could from those drill holes. So what could we be doing to maximize that time? When a drill hole in Chile, for example, costs around about $600 to $700 a metre, that's really important to make sure we're using that resource in a more effective way than at the moment. We're just often blasting through a bunch of rocks, getting some core which sits in a core yard. Are we getting all the information we could get? And particularly when we talk about ore body knowledge, as you are breaking that rock, as you're drilling it, you're getting information around hardness, throughput potentially, different blastability. Are we actually getting all the information we need out of that drill hole as we are doing it? I purposely haven't mentioned critical minerals in this talk, but I think carbon capture is an interesting one for us. It's what is our role as geoscientists to help come up with solutions on what to do with the carbon that the world needs to somehow sequester away from the atmosphere. And we as geoscientists have many of the answers. We can challenge some of the assumptions, and we can come up with some really fascinating solutions as well. Sort of going back to the multi-sensor on drilling, but it's also, the first drill rig I met was in the late 80s. And really the technology has not changed since that point. So for around about 40 years, we're using the same basic way of spinning a rod, bashing a rod into the rocks to make a hole. It's a really inefficient way of doing things. We're seeing drill rigs get safer with guarding, with all these fancy equipment, but the actual fundamental way that we make that hole hasn't changed. I'm sure there must be a better way of doing it. If we got smarter people to think about how we actually drill the holes, whether it's, coiled tube was a really interesting innovation. What are the other ways of actually making holes in the earth? I'm going to steal something from John Van, who I explored this a few years ago, but it was an idea of almost ballistic drilling. You would almost put little bombers down your drill hole and precondition the drill hole in front of you, and it goes faster. That's different, and that would be much faster. It obviously creates a different flow of information for us, but at least we could drill a lot more holes. So I think we're in a paradigm at the moment that we can't get out of. We're very fixed to the styles of drilling we have, And until we actually come up with a different way, we're still going to be held to this real constraint in our industry. Geomet tools. So anyone who's built a geomet model for a large mine, this is a real challenge. For things like JK drop test or SME test, SMC tests, to actually get good information about throughput, those sorts of things, they're very expensive, very timely, take a long time to get. So actually build up a good support model for a large porphyry ore body, for example, is a really difficult process. It requires huge capital and huge time to get that amount of data to support a really robust geomet model. Maybe it links back to the drilling. We're collecting that information anyway as we break the rock. Are there other ways, even as we're cutting core, get information from the core cutter to tell us how strong that rock is? How else can we get information that tells us about the strength, the durability, the fracture of the rock mass we're going through? This is a bit off-piste, but we're also going to have a shortage of geologists. We know that people don't find our industry very interesting anymore. You speak to the average young university crowd out at MDRU, UBC, and they're much more excited by sustainability issues, much more excited by things that are to do with nature and forest, water, fish, those sorts of areas. We are no longer a real draw card to them. So we will have a shortage of skills. How do we confront that? This is riffing on the same theme. It's getting that, bit like mine sensors, giving that information straight away. It's rather than having to wait hours or days for data, how do we have the information straight away that allows us to make much more rapid decisions, much more agile decisions in mines? At the moment, we still are often held back by labs or other things to get us good, reliable information. How do we actually get that knowledge right at the face, right at the core shack, so we're making faster decisions? And this really comes back to the story of Tetris. How do we, as a community, get over the sort of the barriers, silos we have as individual companies, even intellectual groups, and start sharing information? We're trying to solve a global problem, yet we're keeping it very siloed in the way we do it. So for me, there is an element of how do you create much more of an open source world for information about the geoscience of this planet we sit on. And then I think this is the best answer of the whole lot. I don't know. So it's always difficult to say that, but I think sometimes we can sit here and try to predict the future, but really sometimes it's easier just to admit that we're not very good at predicting the future. So just coming back to Willis in his house in Oklahoma, I think we're at this point where we suddenly have all this data. We're at this point where we have these wonderful tools that are helping us solve these problems. How do we take the next step to really effectively use that data and solve some of these big challenges? Part of it, this is a 13-year-old, we need to maybe, and I say this as a 56-year-old man, we need more nimble brains. We need to bring in a new style of thinking in the way we approach problems, solve problems. We need to regenerate our population. And I think in this example, as I've said a number of times, how do we really crowdsource these problems and solve them generally? It was fascinating at the SEG in London. Everyone was wringing their hands about climate change, about critical minerals, about the whole issue that's facing the world, how the world's not listening to us. Well, why aren't they listening to us? If we think it's so important, where are we missing the communication gap to really explain to the rest of the world why this is important and why we may actually have the solution within our hands? Not only are we having trouble communicating amongst ourselves, but we're not getting the message out to the world either. So we can learn a bit from these young kids and their Tetris example on just how to solve a problem and share the problem and really then tell the problem to the world or tell the solution to the world. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Stuart. That was really
challenging. I was a bit depressed when you put up the example of just picking up rocks behind robotic trucks, but then my hope rose as you described the new role of geoscience at the end there. So thanks very much. We do have 5 minutes, so let's take some questions from the audience. If anyone has questions, yes?
Yeah, I've got actually 2 questions. One sort of anecdotal, but why was a geologist supposed to babysit the Artemis robot? Is it a corporate reason? Is it a lack of trust in the system, or is it really needed?
Really good question. I think, once again, those who've worked in mines understand that sometimes rules exist because they exist. So I think it was, we were doing something different, and therefore, because it was different, the engineers didn't understand what we were doing, therefore they wanted us to be there to watch it. Chile is also a rather rules-based society, so sometimes there's just rules. I would hope that once that system becomes normal, that would become irrelevant. But yeah, we'll see.
Yeah. And second question is, so we've talked a lot about DataCube and sharing knowledge. I'm just curious as how open would tech be at making their data available to other people?
I walked into that one, didn't I? Yeah, exactly. So look, I'm going to flip that to my experience as an Australian geologist. So in Australia, we had no choice. If we did exploration anywhere in Australia, we had to submit all our data at the end of the year. That data went into the government surveys, and once a certain confidentiality period was over, that became open knowledge for everyone, and you can sort that data. In Canada, that works to a degree, but it's linked to expenditure and reporting. So it's not a perfect system here. The US doesn't work at all. So I think different regimes have come up with better ways to almost force people to share data. Now, we've also, going back a few years here, but challenges like the Goldcorp challenge was a fascinating example of sharing data and allowing the world to come in and try to solve the problem. That 10 terabytes of information would be fun to actually put out to a hacker group and see, okay, what can you find in this data? Our challenge is, given it's 100 years old, we're not sure exactly who owns the data in all situations and where the data came from. So there's a certain, any company's going to have that around the source of every bit of information. So that's a bit of the cleaning we have to do. But no, it's a really good point. I think I can pontificate about this problem, but until companies like tech start to do something different, then it's just words.
Probably time for one more. Shall we go right up the back?
You don't have to.
Yeah, go ahead.
Stuart, quick question. You talk about the role of the geoscientist. If we step one back and think about students entering the industry going forward, should we be aiming that they come out of university, and there's no right answer to this, so apologise in advance, should we be aiming that they come out with a sound foundation in geoscience so they can critically evaluate the answers that are coming out of machine learning tools or whatever, versus coming out fully fledged more in the moving away from the traditional side of geoscience, coming out to basically be a computer modeler without really seeing rocks?
Yeah. It's a good question. I think we still want our universities to be giving the basics, to train well-rounded geoscientists who can then go on after their initial degree to do a master's or something else, or come into a company and learn while doing. So I think you still need that fundamental foundation of information to allow you then to make choices. I think the interesting thing about where we're now is when we came out, I'm looking at John here, when we came out, there was really only one choice. As a geologist, exploration geologist, you were off in the bush and you may be gone for months at a time. That was just the reality of our job. There were it was a two-way radio if you're lucky. It was a different world. So what attracted people to the industry then, now we actually have a completely different proposition. We have a whole range of different roles that we can be offering. And if people do want to stay in the city, why not? If they want to go out in the remote areas, absolutely. So we actually have a better model now for attracting talent than we used to.
Good. Unfortunately, we have to leave it there, but those who had poised questions maybe can corral Stuart at the break. But thank you very much, Stuart.